Welcome everyone, and as usual, it's Alex from Riot Gaming. The game that we'll be talking about today is the final installment in an iconic series from the post-apocalyptic horror survival genre, the Metro series. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like to help the channel grow. And now, without further ado, let us dive into Metro Exodus. When I think of most games that left a lasting impression on me, first and foremost I think of the story, and with the story we shall begin. It took me a bit less than 30 hours to complete the main game's story. But as it is always the case for me, that time includes massive delays along the way as I explored almost everything each location had to offer. In this game, we see Artyom, the protagonist of the previous games, continuing to chase his dream of a life beyond the miserable tunnel existence the people of Moscow are leading after the nuclear war of the 20th century. This leads him to a series of revelations which allow him and his men to leave the confines of the Moscow subway system and embark on an epic adventure across the entire continent and many semi-open world locations while looking for a suitable place to live. In terms of writing, I could only appreciate it this much since I know this kind of life. The game is oozing with this Russian spirit. To describe what I'm talking about, I would call it something like a romanticized Soviet Russia. This is going to sound weird, but think about this game like this. As the westerns that we have about cowboys, or the Akira Kurosawa movies that we have about samurai, so does this Metro game sort of gives positively stereotypical vibes about Soviet people. It all has to do with the mentality that these people took with them beyond the apocalypse that destroyed their homes and lives. The simple yet meaningful story of this game is overflowing with sweet moments of the Russian way of life. It is all these attributes of life and the culture of speech which are very specific and might not be quite understood when played in English. Just saying. But let me say something about how the open world formula this time influences the story. For around 2/3 of your gameplay, you will encounter the new open world locations that were previously explored only in small areas in Metro Last Light. But more towards the end, the game returns to its linear roots, so to say. The locations become more like wide corridors rather than big open locations, which makes you wonder, should have they tried to go open world in the first place? Of course it was exciting at first, but the story was sort of lagging behind, being stretched and slowed down at these points. The only thing that really kept me going were the amazing design and atmosphere of these open world sections. Gameplay in them was thrilling as you scavenged for supplies in a gorgeous post-apocalyptic world and scouting the areas while making marks on your map. But I remembered that there is a compelling story about a tightly knit group of survivors fighting against overwhelming odds only at the very end, when they returned to the linear level design and focused on the story, albeit to quickly rush it towards some sort of conclusion. To be honest, I personally was not disappointed by the end, and it even reminded me of how much I grew to care about the characters and their motivations in the story. But nevertheless, it was rushed and reached its culmination in a very steep rise from slow methodical survival to a tense, heart-pounding old-school Metro. Now let me gush about the main and strongest point of this game, the world. The Metro series setting became a memorable icon in the genre of post-apocalyptic games. But the fact that this time you get out of Moscow opened up an entire new world, the entirety of what remained of the 20th century Russia in 2035. This lets the developers explore all the major landmarks the country has to offer from one end to the other and imagine how all of it was transformed by the nuclear catastrophe. At the very least, I think this alone warrants a playthrough of the game. The world. The environments are nuts. As I said, most of the game will be in open world locations that are brimming with original and interesting content. Side quests, treasure stashes, anomalies, and mysterious abandoned facilities. These can be completely ignored in favor of continuing the story, but may drastically affect the outcome of the story missions. The side content is there in part for interesting side activities and in part for meaningful rewards and stories that can influence the main campaign. There are people you can meet to find out useful information, or an abandoned area that is filled with mutants but has a weapon or gear upgrade, which will be lost forever when you move on with the story. So it is always up to you if you want to skip it and risk missing significant portions of gear and side stories, or risk wasting ammo and supplies on a run into some dangerous spots that can yield great rewards. And as always, gameplay is my longest section, and boy is there a lot to talk about here. But let's go step by step and take a look at the things that left the biggest impression on me. First, we have the lack of interface that creates a very interesting sense of presence and intensity. When you have to look at the map in your hands to discern where you are, when you understand that you should switch the filter of your gas mask because the character starts breathing heavily, or that you are running out of stamina because your character's ears start ringing from the blood pressure. Some of these things, like the mask filters, existed since the very first game, and some, like the ears ringing, were added in this one. Nevertheless, this HUD-less approach is what made this post-apocalyptic survivor horror stand out, and it continues to do so in this final installment. All these little things are what immerses you in the game and makes every incursion you make into each of the locations feel like a meaningful struggle, while not imposing unnecessary limits on gameplay. This now and always did make Metro stand out for me amongst all the other shooters. And unfortunately, there are still not many FPSs that would focus on immersion so much. In most, you still feel like a floating camera with a gun that feels awesome to use, but nonetheless, you are a floating camera and not a living person. When you go out into each of the locations you visit, you will use your binoculars to scout out places of interest and mark them on your map for future visits. During these travels, as I already mentioned, you will come across resources, weapon and gear upgrades, and side quests. These resources are used in the new crafting and modding system. It allows you to craft your own ammo, medkits, and grenades, but also requires you to maintain your weapons and gear. Some of the upgrades, like modding the weapon, can be done on the fly. You can remove your backpack and switch out a scope or a silencer while crafting additional arrows for your crossbow. But there are more complicated manipulations that will require a workbench. Things like crafting more complex ammo, fixing your gas mask, or cleaning the weapon to keep it in working condition. I also must put forth the topic of choices in this game as its own separate section. For example, whether you decide to face a group of cultists head-on and kill them all, or attack but spare those who surrender, or act with stealth and avoid conflict entirely, all might affect the way their people talk about you, and even bring to an easier or harder final encounter before transferring to the next location. These choices will accumulate, affect your allies, and lead you towards two very different endings. Also, the game does not hold your hand in this regard. There will be no button prompts to choose one outcome or the other. It is seamless and entirely depends on the way you decide to play the game and the tasks you decide to complete before a major act. Now, the immersion factors are all good and dandy, but the game is by no means perfect. While the feeling of presence in the action is far greater than in most modern FPSs, the shooting itself is kind of crappy. Kind of. In a game like Metro, it is supposed to be more realistic and grounded, but at the same time, the artificial sense of impact and the somewhat exaggerated weapon handling that became a staple in modern representatives of the genre create a satisfying feeling of using the weapon. And since these are not utilized in this game, many people might find the shooting in Metro somewhat lacking. We also have to mention the bugs. There are still unpolished corners, bugs in the physics, clunky animations, weird sounds and lip sync. The enemy AI is also clunky as hell with quite outdated behavior. But all in all, it is sort of there to compensate for the fact that combat can be very disorienting with all the immersion factors I mentioned before. When a small mistake can cost you your life, especially on the higher difficulties, you sometimes feel grateful for the generously slow reaction time of the enemies and how dumb are the mutants. The abrupt ending of the story that might be somewhat underwhelming for some people is compensated by the DLCs. The Gold Edition comes with the 2 story DLCs that were released for the game post-launch, the 2 Colonels and Sam's story. Before we continue though, be warned, there will be slight spoilers about visited locations in the main game and the fate of one of the crew members in the descriptions of the DLCs. So in case you are very sensitive to this sort of stuff, you may skip to the conclusion right away. First we have the 2 Colonels. It is a short campaign that took me only around 2 hours to complete. During the main story, Artyom and his crew visit Novosibirsk. There you learn of the tragic fate that befell the residents as they were hiding in the city's metro tunnels just like in Moscow. And this DLC tells the story of what happened there through the eyes of one of the mentioned colonels. Colonel Khlebnikov was an honest man and one of those in charge of organizing the life in the subway system. The events are traced all the way up to the moment Artyom and his crew arrived there in the main campaign. Now let's talk about Sam's story. This is a bigger DLC and a proper one at that. It took me around 9 hours to complete. It's almost a third of what the main campaign took me. In this DLC, you play as Sam, a former US Marine that was guarding the United States Embassy in Moscow as the nuclear attacks happened. He ended up in the metro, as all those who evacuated, learned perfect Russian and was one of the crew members in Artyom's team in the main campaign. Regardless of the ending in the main story, Sam decides to embark on his own journey to travel to the city of Vladivostok. Being a big port in Russia and a way out to the Pacific Ocean through the Sea of Japan, he hopes to find there a boat back home. It takes quite a while to finish, involves entirely new characters, story and a new semi-open world area, which actually strikes a better balance between the linear strengths of the developers and Metro as a franchise, while refreshing the gameplay with open locations that have multiple side objectives and quests. You can do these for upgrades, materials, weapons, etc. Or you can simply go straight towards the main story objective and skip all that stuff entirely. Though I would not recommend doing that because you would miss on a lot of interesting things. It has lots of secrets, loot, stories and even some puzzles. And here, the story also has 2 endings and certain relationships with characters depend on the side objectives you encounter along the way. For as long as I played, neither the dumb AI of the enemies nor the occasional bugs could ruin the immense charm of this game. I salute the developers. They have created, all in all, a really good game, one that people will remember and can always come back to because of its absolutely unique atmosphere that you shall not find anywhere else. It was filled with good characters, with interesting places, meaningful gameplay mechanics, and is a game definitely worthy of a place amongst the best post-apocalyptic survival horror games. And this was everything. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you found this video useful. As usual, this was Alex, and I hope to see you in the next one.